It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce the Reverend Steve Lindsley and Ruling Elder Kevin Hyrams from Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, sharing a presentation with us entitled Doing the Work, Interpreting Racism in Congregational Settings. I called your attention to their biographies found on page 3 of the Commissioner's Handbook. Reverend Lindsley and Elder Hyrams, welcome. Let us please raise your hands in the participants window. Unmute yourselves. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? That's always a question you got to ask on a Zoom, right?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. It's good to be with you. I popped in right during Elton John. Any Presbyterian meeting that includes Elton John, that's a good sign. Let me introduce myself. My name is Steve Lindsley. I am the senior pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlotte. We are a congregation of about 500 members. And just for context, pretty predominantly white. And that's kind of who we are. And I'll let my colleague Kevin introduce himself.
Well, fantastic. Great morning to everyone. I'm Kevin R. Hyrams. I'm a father of 3 adult children and the husband of Reverend British Hyrams, who's a Presbyterian minister and a campus minister at North Carolina Central. It's a great time to be here. As Steve indicated, he is my pastor at Trinity, and we enjoy the opportunities to just share the journey we went on with doing the work. It's an honor to be here before you, and we hope that today's discussion will stimulate some thoughts for you, and we'll make ourselves available even outside of today. But it's an honor, and thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Kevin. Indeed, it's an honor to be with you all. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and let's see if this will work. Everybody see that? All right, we're going to get started here. So our purpose today, and remind me of what time we need to be wrapping this up. Somebody could make mention of that.
Yeah, it is, our small groups start at 10:50.
All right, perfect. We got good time here.
Got plenty of time, yeah.
Yep. Great. All right. Yeah, we're ahead of Presbyterian meeting. I heard y'all ahead of schedule. That happens every now and once in a blue moon, right? Praise Jesus. So I want to give you a quick overview of sort of what Kevin and I are going to do. We're going to talk about a journey that our church went on, started actually last spring and is still on, and talk to you about what we are doing and have done in the journey, some of the challenges of this journey, and then offer up some what we think might be best practices for if you and your congregations might be thinking about a similar journey. And as the title says, interrupting racism in congregational settings, and really working to do that beyond just the congregation, but in the greater kind of world. So I want to lay a little bit of groundwork about what this workshop is and what it's not. The workshop is a narrative of a congregation that's attempting to confront white supremacy culture in itself and in the surrounding community in order to work toward becoming an anti-racist organization. Now that's a mouthful. And there are 2 terms in particular that I want to unpack, because I think they're really key that we all understand what I mean when I say them. When I say white supremacy culture, what I am not talking about are like the egregious forms of white supremacy. So Charlottesville 2017, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, you name it, those kinds of things that we see a lot on the news and hear a lot about. I'm talking about the underlying tension of racism that's been part of our world, in our country for quite some time, that in essence, in different ways, puts people of color in a disadvantaged position and white people in an advantaged position. So that's what I mean when I say white supremacy culture. I just want to clarify that. The other thing I want to clarify is what I mean when I say an anti-racist organization. Ibram Kendi, who is a wonderful author and writer on some of these matters, talks about how there is, you're either racist or you're anti-racist. You can't be just not racist, right? You can't just be, I'm against racism, but I'm not going to do anything about it. By not doing anything about it, you're actually furthering racist structures. So part of what we are seeking to do in this, and I'm talking about in this workshop, is how we as individuals and as a church can work to become an anti-racist organization, to work to dismantle racist structures in our society.
Hey, Steve, can I interject here too?
Yeah, anytime, jump in.
Yeah, so for everyone, this objective statement was very powerful for our discussions, as Steve indicated, and I'll start, and I usually do this early, and I'll do it again. Kevin R. Hyrams does not speak for all Black people. I represent my views and my life that I've had experiences for. There, within the Black race, there's a lot of different perspectives. So we're not a monolithic or entity, just like white people are not a monolithic. So I always want to give that disclaimer because I just want to be truthful. But when we get to this narrative and talking about white supremacy, it was important to really go through. It's real easy to parse out those really egregious definitions. But as a Black person, we talk about white supremacy in very subtle ways. And it was important to get the ground rules set for embarking upon this journey, to even talk about the things that may be subtle that needed to be confronted and call it what it is. It's a white supremacy environment. So it was really powerful to have those discussions, to get buy-in, to really define what we view white supremacy as being. And then that part of anti-racist, it's almost like if you take no action, then you're advocating for those opinions and those really activities that continue to suppress people. So we're asking people to not just listen, but to take action. So I wanted to just come in and say that, Steve, as you know, my feelings on it, and certainly your feelings, and really everyone that participated in these workshops. So.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Absolutely. The workshop is also an acknowledgement of the inherent challenges in this work that we all, I think, understand. It's complicated, it's messy, but it's something that we need to lean into. So, and I acknowledge as a white person talking about racism that I am going to mess up, right? In this workshop today with you all day, I'm going to mess up in what I might say or express. And that's part of the journey that we all are on. This work is hard work and messy work, but necessary work. What this workshop is not, it is not an exhaustive know-it-all of how this should be done. This is not a 10-step manual that you're getting today that you go and follow and then, yay, we've solved the problem of being an anti-racist organization. It's not that. It is ongoing work. It is not a completed journey. To that same point, it is still going on and will be going on for quite some time. I meant to say at the top, by the way, I believe there is time at the end of this presentation if there are large group questions before you go into small group questions. So if you have a question for the large group, maybe jot it down, and then at the end we'll circle back to a time for questions, okay? The other thing I want to talk about, and this is one of the many reasons why I'm glad to have my good friend Kevin here today, is the importance of having an accountability partner in this work. Somebody ideally that you're already in relationship with, someone that there's a level of trust involved, someone to keep you honest. And to the clergy out there, my fellow clergy, you know how it is. You get a lot of people telling you what you want to hear. And maybe not enough people telling you what you need to hear, or maybe you get people that are take great joy in telling you what you need to hear all the time, but you want to hear what you need to hear, not just what you want to hear. And so part of Kevin's role here today, and again, I'm so grateful to have Kevin here, in addition to being my friend and my colleague and part of this journey with me, is that he is also he's modeling this in this workshop today. So Kevin chimes in as he's already done. If I say something that Kevin's like, Steve, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, he's going to chime in and jump in and say that. And I think that's important, that we have those people on this journey that just help keep us on task and on track. So Kevin, thanks.
Yeah.
Again.
Well, I just want to say, for those of us that are accountability partners, there's an inherent bias sometimes when we play those roles. And I'll just lay it out. There are times when I may say things, I may get portrayed as the typical angry Black man in the room. There's a lot of ways to get portrayed when you take on these roles. So I'm really sensitive to how I surface the objections. I also try to talk about solutions, but it's important as well, because it could have been really easy for Steve to choose an accountability partner of a pastor that he knows well, may be of the same ethnicity, and we don't get the outcomes that we're looking for. It would be also easy for me to choose an accountability partner, African-American male. We share same backgrounds. So we're really stretching ourselves to match with someone that we've deliberately built a rapport with, and we're working together to drive the outcomes because we learn from each other regularly. So that's very early in that process.
Great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yep.
So let me tell you about how this all got started at Trinity. Go back in time to spring 2020. Feels like a whole lot longer than just a few months, 12, 15 months ago, whatever like that, doesn't it? In the spring of 2020, there were a few things that sort of intersected. One, of course, were the shooting deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd in pretty rapid succession. And coupled with that, of course, we started in a global pandemic. And, I've had conversations with my church members about what it was about that just made, it isn't like these three individuals, in the police shootings, this is the first time this has happened, but something about it in this moment seemed to really jump out. And I wonder if it's the fact that in a pandemic, that was when we were all stayed home. We didn't have our busy lives to distract us from it. We were able to really focus on it and had to focus on it. We couldn't not see it. And again, I know that people of color have been like, it's been happening all the time. Why have you not seen it? But that's part of the whole problem, right? The whole issue. So I started having church members come to me and say, Steve, we've got to do something about this. What can we do? And I had a colleague of mine, a colleague of color, that one day posted on Facebook, "White people do the work." And to me, that resonated with me as a clear calling, a challenge. Like, this is our problem, and this is our work that needs to happen. So we need to do the work. So out of that came what we call at Trinity the Doing the Work Initiative. That's how it got its name. We created a purpose statement, and I'll just read it out for you. You can read it on the screen. To dig deeper into the nuances of systemic racism, own our part in it, and do the hard work of dismantling racist structures in ourselves in order that we as white people can more effectively work to dismantle racial systems around us and serve as allies for people of color. So that is a mouthful, but that is the overarching goal of what this effort was designed to do and to help us accomplish. When we started this Doing the Work initiative, we wanted to sort of set a baseline out of which everything was going to operate from. Some assumptions about race and privilege and systemic structures and what it means to be white in the world. As I alluded to before, Trinity Presbyterian is predominantly, overwhelmingly white. And so we wanted to lay these assumptions out so that everybody had that baseline in order for the work that they were going to do to be most effective. So I want to share some of these assumptions with you. The first is that systemic racism is all around us. We are part of it. The vast majority of the time, we white people fail to see it. It is the water we've been swimming in all of our lives. It is the air that we are breathing. It has been part of our nation's history for 400 years and counting. And it is, we don't see it as white people as readily as our colleagues of color and friends of color see it. But it is around us. And so we first, I think, have to acknowledge that in order to move forward. Our tendency, though, as white people, is to draw distinctions between ourselves and what we would say more overt racism. Kevin used a similar term. I can't remember exactly what that was, egregious terms. And our tendency to distance ourselves from what we see as the more egregious kinds and to identify that as the real racism. Our tendency to distance ourselves from that only serves to further racist structures more. So I hear this a lot of times when I hear friends of color say, well, I'm not racist because I would never go to Charlottesville, or I'm not racist because I would never say that awful thing that that person said to the person in Central Park, that black person, when they pulled out the video camera. I would never be part of Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. I mean, and I think when we white people do that, what we do is we absolve ourselves from having any part in it and having to do any work in it. So what I always, one of the foundations that we launched into this Doing the Work initiative was to say racism is not just the really, really, really bad stuff that gets all the press. It's more underlying, covert kinds of things that we are part of, and we have to acknowledge that. This is a key thing. It's not the responsibility of people of color to explain racism to white people. And I've heard before, you know, where a Bible study will say, well, we want to study racism. Who's a person of color that we could get to come and teach us about? And that is I think an unfair burden to put solely on people of color. Certainly they have things that they can share and ought to be given the ability and the avenue to do it should they choose. But racism is white people are the architects of racism, right? Has been for hundreds of years. People of color are its victims. So the problem of racism is ours to solve as white people, and everybody working together. But what we cannot do is simply say, you know, I'll let somebody who's experiencing it talk about it, because that's not really, I don't think is an effective way to do that.
Yeah, and Steve, let me chime in, and I'll just say I probably have comments regularly on each of the slides, but we're on a time constraint, so I'm really letting as much of this go and only interjecting when
chime in whenever.
Things. But you know, one of the things when you said victims, there's a mindset that I like to really characterize it as. You know, Black people are survivors. We tend to look at the scenarios, the oppressive states that we've had for 400 years plus in this country, yet we still find ways to excel, and we still find ways to call out what's being done. And in instances where we amass enough, where we get a platform, you know, there are avenues that gets a lot of attention, but we all play a role in overcoming the racism. So I may not be one that will be on the soapbox or the platform talking about the masses doing things, but in a very more, what I would say, compelling and subtle way, we're going to go through these types of forums, and I'm going to play a role to do what I think is right, and that is to explain the outcomes of the behaviors that are being taken by white people. And what Steve has opened it up for is for people to finally accept that there are racists that people say they're not. They are racist, and here are the reasons why. And I appreciate it that they didn't put me in a spot to really come in and say, here's why you're a racist, because I don't feel like I need to come in and explain that you're a racist. All we need to do is present the facts, and those things take care of itself. So we're survivors, and I like that mindset as such versus victims, because enough times, and we talk about this a lot, I don't want a white savior to come in and help me and my destiny. I want to have that level of control. Of course, we're in a religious setting, but through God. But, you know, I don't need white people to define my success. And I want to make sure that people understood that, and that it's a platform where we're saying, look, we need your help. We can't do this collectively without people in power willing to relinquish some of that power. And that's really, in essence, what we're trying to get accomplished. And we can live symbiotically by doing so. So yeah. Cognizant of the time. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for that. And see, this is a value of an accountability partner. I know to go in and change the PowerPoint, change it from victims to survivors. So I'll make a note on that. I appreciate that's what this is about. So thank you for that. Let's see, moving on. I think it's important when we're talking about this kind of work that there's some internal work that has to happen first before we do external work, right? I don't know about y'all's churches, but my churches, we love to see an issue or a problem out there and figure out how to solve it out there. This is an issue that there needs to be some internal personal work first before we are going to be able to effectively deal with the larger systemic nature of it. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I think there needs to be, it's important to realize that there is sort of a balance, a joint venture of, to that last point, action, doing stuff, but also self-education, which is maybe not the greatest term, but really leaning into us learning and listening in this particular topic, listening to and engaging voices that are different from our own. And you really need both of those, right? If all you're doing is listening and engaging voices and not doing action, then you're a book club. And Trinity has a lot of book clubs, and we love to read books. But then it just kind of ends there at the end of the book, and you move on to another book. So it can't be just a book club, but it also can't just be action, because you need to have something backing it up. And again, some internal work and transformation that's taking place as well. The other thing I want to acknowledge to my white colleagues in the room here is that white fragility is real. And I'm not looking at screens. I'm just looking at my PowerPoint. But I know, because I have been there, that when you start digging into this stuff and start talking about it, as white people, there's a little bit inside you that goes, oh, and starts to feel a little, and you start to rationalize or explain or distance yourself or push back. I've done every single one of those because my white fragility kicks in constantly. And I think one of the key things for us white people in the room when we're doing this work is to acknowledge that that is real, that it's going to happen, to recognize it when it happens, to acknowledge it, name it, and then move on from it. Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility that we'll talk about in a second, she describes white fragility as a muscle that you haven't used in a while. Like if you haven't run and you suddenly start running again, your legs are going to be sore, right? The calf muscles are going to be burning. So that's going to happen, this same thing. But what we do is we build up our stamina by talking about this, by engaging it over and over again to the point where that white fragility is not as pronounced as it once was. And I think that's a really key, important point for us white siblings in order to effectively do this work, or we kind of shut ourselves down before we really get into the meat of stuff. The last thing is that the work is never done. There's no journey, there's no certificate waiting for us at the end of this. It's constant work, and that's okay, because this is important work to do. So let me pivot now into talking specifically about what we at Trinity did. We launched it as a 6-week endeavor, but we encouraged folks to continue beyond that. With a long list of resources, it was possible for people to, continue doing stuff even now. But again, there was no certificate. It's not like 6 weeks and you're done. There were two main actions or movements, I guess you could say, that people engaged. One was engaging, a variety of resources, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And then the other is sort of a routine of responding to those resources with some questions and some opportunities for learning and growth. The resource list that we gave is compiled from various lists and resources. It's nothing unique to Trinity. There was a Google Doc that floated out back in the spring with just a whole long list of resources. Maybe some of y'all use that. We borrowed from that. We pulled in other resources. We're still adding to it. So there's nothing, unique about it. But this is a list that we had here. So for the engaging portion over the course of these 6 weeks, over the course of the entirety of the 6 weeks, we asked everybody to read 2 books. One was White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, just as a baseline. And then the second was a book of their choosing. And again, there was a list of about 12 or 16 books, and people could choose whatever books they wanted, one of those other books. And of course they could read more, but at least 2. They were asked to watch 2 movies. One was the movie Colorblind, which is just a great primer for sort of racism in our country. And then a second movie, again, a long list of movies that they could choose from. They were invited to listen to all 6 episodes of the 1619 Project, which I understand has kind of become a bit of a hot topic in their school systems that are banning it and things like that. What we found that was really helpful is really it's just stories being told by people who are not like me about their experience of being Black, essentially, in America. And there was, I think, great value in that. So we invited all of our folks to listen to those 6 episodes. And then once a week, there were a list of articles, short articles that people were invited to read 2 a week. And then there were short videos, TED Talks, and things of that nature. And they were invited to watch one of those each a week. So you sort of see how here's the 6-week thing, and then here's the individual week kind of thing moving along. So we were really trying to encourage people to engage different resources. Some people are drawn to reading. Some people are drawn to videos. Some people are drawn to podcasts, finding different media that people could engage along the way. And then, let's see, I got to move my little thing here because it's blocking the screen. The other thing that I think was really important, honestly, is that with the exception of White Fragility, all of the other resources that we put out there were written by, produced by, recorded by, made by people of color. We just felt that if there was any moment when we needed to lift up voices of color and their perspectives and their insight, it was this moment. So we wanted to make sure that we did that. Let's see. Respond. All right, so the respond part we asked people to do for each of the resources or most of the resources to at least carve out a little bit of time when they were done with it to come up with a few statements of what they learned, something they didn't know before that they knew now, had some insight on. We asked them to note instances in engaging that resource when their white fragility kicked in. And this was intentional. We wanted people to start being able to recognize when their white fragility was peaked and why, because that helps them to manage that and move through that better the next time. And then, if there was an idea that popped in head of action steps, like what we do next, to just jot that down for future reference. Sometimes when you're reading something, you have an aha moment, and we wanted people to have space to sort of record those for any kind of future use.
Yeah, Steve, I think that I also wanted to reiterate, as we went through those action steps, there was a level of encouragement that we're really asking for a lifestyle and mindset shift. We're not asking you to go through a systematic approach and saying, all right, I've got 2 particular areas and I'm going to do things differently. Well, it doesn't matter if you're going to do 2 things differently and aligns with doing the work, and then you have 25 other things that are still reinforcing old behavior. So the aspect is you choose 2 or 3 to surface, but we're asking that you're going to go through an entire inventory of everything that you're doing where you've identified, racist behavior, and correct those. And then later we'll talk about what we're asking you to do to ensure that those around you are embracing that same behavior. So it's great when you talked. I just wanted to reinforce, we're highlighting a couple, but we're asking for everything that you're doing, that there's a mindset shift.
Yep.
So
exactly. Yeah, for sure, Kevin. Thanks. We also encourage people to find an accountability partner, much the same, what I was talking about in this presentation, accountability partner, but somebody to pair with, to just check in, share learnings, how you've grown, where you've struggled, just to have somebody to kind of process that with. Of course, this is happening during a pandemic, right? And this is back when everything was stay at home. So we were not gathering together in person for any kind of small group or large group things around this. So we were really trying to create a scenario where people could connect with another person to sort of be on the journey with them as they were going through things. So that was the idea of how it all was set out at the beginning. And so this is how it went, and in essence, how it is still going. We had about 50 people from our congregation sign up to participate. That's about 1/10 of our congregation. So they went through the, April, May, June, July, doing this sort of thing. By the time we got to July and August, I started having people saying, Steve, we really want to get together as a group and talk about this some more. And we know we can't do that in person. So I know this is going to be a shocker, but we had some Zooms, and we had 3 Zooms together. The first Zoom, we talked about white fragility, because again, we thought that was an important baseline. The second, we talked about the 1619 Project. And then the third one was the one that it was pretty open-ended. And it really was, what do we do now? Because that was a question that I started getting from a lot of people. Hey, we're doing this work, we're reading this stuff, we're doing all this stuff, but what do we do? And we were pretty intentional about holding off from diving right into the doing part until we as a group were able to really sink our teeth into some of these resources and these voices and these experiences. I think a lot of times in churches, what we do is we see a problem and we immediately want to go solve it. And oftentimes what we end up doing is okay, but maybe not the best way to address it. And I found that if you allow space for people to sit in a little while longer, even though that can be uncomfortable because people are like, I want to do something. If you give them space to meet and just be in that uncomfortable space, the things that you wind up doing oftentimes end up being better things to do. I've found, at least. And one of the things that came out of that, and one of the things that we did was, I started noting in these Zooms and also just in one-on-ones that I was having with people throughout, of folks in our church that I felt were particularly engaged and energized by this work. Because my thinking, and you all are church leaders, so you know it, right, is that if you find people that are energized by something, they're probably good people to be part of that thing, right? So I started noting people that were really energized by this, doing the work and by these Zooms, and I asked them individually if they would be interested in being part of an anti-racism task force for our church. And every one of them said yes. And it's so wonderful when that happens, when you ask people in the church to do something and every one of them says yes. So I took that to session. They knew that something was going to be coming because I've been talking about it with session for a few months now, which I think is, I'll talk about that in a little bit, about how we need to be priming our leaders for this instead of just sort of throwing them all at once. So by the time that it came to session with these 6 people to be part of an anti-racism task force, they were all on board with it, and session approved that. And what the task force is tasked with doing is to really go and study about what next steps for our church might be to becoming an anti-racist organization, and then bring those back to session for session's approval. And let me see, as part of their work, I think 4 of the 6 members attended Crossroads anti-racism training that was, well, it was through Monterey. It wasn't at Monterey because this was back in the fall and nobody was going anywhere. And then also contracted for about a month or 6 weeks with a Next Church anti-racism coach. And they've been meeting, I think, every other Monday evening for 6 months now. They have met with Session twice to mainly glean information from them and do some small group work for them in the wonderful breakout rooms that you can do on Zoom. And eventually, perhaps in the fall, they'll come back to Session with some recommendations that Session will then have an opportunity to act upon. So that's kind of what we did and what we're still doing. And like I said, it is work that is still ongoing. The last thing that Kevin and I want to do is just to share with you some best practices, some things that we have learned about this, that if you and your congregations decide you want to do something similar, these might be some helpful things to keep in mind. The first thing is building up stamina for the fact that you're going to make mistakes and you're going to mess up along the way and it's going to be messy. I'm somebody that I don't like messing up. If I'm going to put something out there, I want it to be right the first time. If I'm moving an initiative along through a committee or session, I kind of want to guide it along or let them guide it along, but just, that it ends up being quote unquote successful. I think in this work, you have to acknowledge the fact that you're going to mess up, that it's going to be messy, and you need to be okay with that. And to not let your fear or concern about it being messy or messing up along the way keep you from doing this important work.
Yeah, and Stephen, that's on all sides. I just want to make sure I reiterate that is from all ethnic groups that are participating in this. I know I've made a number of mistakes, either how I characterize the statement that came out or some of the things that are being stated. So that stamina had to convey on my side as well. And I think it's really allowed it to be rich, because if I'm thinking it, I'll say it, and then it's kind of get that immediate feedback. But everyone knows when they're going in, it's really, we're coming at this with pure hearts and with the best of intentions. And that has allowed for people to really come in and really get at opening up so that we can have those discussions along the way. Yep. So stamina was a great word for it too.
Absolutely. I think it's important to be honest with yourselves and with your congregation, and your congregation being honest with themselves about, if you're doing this work, why you're doing it. Is it because it's what you know you're supposed to do, or is it because you truly want to be part of this important work? So just to be a level of honesty and transparency about what it is that's leading you to take this on. We mentioned before about how it begins with leadership. So for the clergy in the room here, who are your key leaders? Your session, obviously. Who are others that you could have conversations with about this to move it forward? For our ruling elders in the room, how might you engage your pastor or pastors in a way that sort of gets them on board and begins building momentum for this work? But I think it's key to get the leaders of your church on board, and then let it filter out from there to the members.
Yeah, and Steve, I wanted to just make sure that I recognize that last point. I think I shared with Steve, with my wife being a pastor or a reverend. I heard a story of an associate pastor that was preaching and fit in the sermon issues of white supremacy and things. And then fundamentally, there were people in the congregation that went to the head pastor and basically threatened to leave the church because that associate pastor taught from the pulpit issues of racism. And of course, I'm got this bleeding heart. I'm like, you've got to be kidding, because obviously that associate pastor's livelihood is resting with that congregation and with that church. And to have people in the congregation feel that emboldened to go and say, we don't like that sermon, and if we ever hear another issue along that line come up, then we're leaving. And I was just appalled that that happened in a Presbyterian church, a PCUSA church, mind you. And it was just something that I had an issue. And this associate pastor was a white female pastor. So I recognize that you're taking a lot of steps, brave steps, to come out and take these positions. I don't have an answer on this of how it gets addressed with your congregation, but I certainly say I recognize anytime someone from the pulpit takes these steps to go toward eradicating racism in this country. So thank you. But when I saw in sermons, that example just blew my mind that it was that egregious of a anti racism sentiment within the congregation. So,
right.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
I think to frequently explain terminology like white supremacy culture, like I did at the top of this workshop. I mean, anytime that I say white supremacy culture in a sermon, I immediately follow it with, this is not what I'm talking about. This is what I am talking about. Because I think it's important to just continue to get in people's minds so that everybody's clear on what you're referring to. To be aware, again, for the white people in the room, of the defense mechanisms of white fragility in those and around you. To the point that Kevin just made, to come and make a bold proclamation like, if this is ever spoken in the pulpit, I'm leaving. I mean, that's white fragility at its heart right there. It's white fragility that's projected as power and dominance, but it's born out of white fragility because it's uncomfortable for white people to talk about this a lot of times. And, so I just be aware of it, expect it, and then know how to work and help your people work through it. And I think, Kevin, the last two were two that I believe you were going to lift up specifically. You may already have it. Feel free to speak to them some more.
Yeah, and this was the one where we talked about in our small groups, the opportunities for white people to share with others. It comes up where people are talking about Black behaviors and Black people, and it just bothered me to hear that people weren't speaking up in those circles and really putting people in check when they're saying things that are really contrary to their beliefs. It's almost like, and when I have an obligation as well, if people are talking about Jewish people, Italian people, Polish people, and making, ethnic jokes, it's my responsibility to speak up and say that's really not appropriate. But yet, when we're in an environment where it's predominantly white and these conversations come up, it's hard for me to believe that you're upholding your commitments if you don't speak up and ask people to think differently and to really reinforce your position and really come against, what they're saying. So those are really the litmus tests, whether you're really doing what you're saying you're doing. It's almost like, in the end, where's your character a lot of times? And if anything, it's when other people aren't there to observe it. That's when the character trait has really been embedded. So those are things that I've asked the questions, and people have actually said, well, I didn't want to ruffle. They're my brother-in-law, they're my sister-in-law. And I'll just say, in the last 4 years, we've heard a lot of things that were contrary to that racism exists in America that just appalled me. Since we've had this, we've had the issue of the insurrection, and we're hearing whitewashing of that incident. If we don't speak up against that, then we're really an active participant, in other words. So those are really the end of the comments, because it's as clear as day. Fight for your beliefs on all accounts.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll leave you with is some resources. So this is a link to our website to Doing the Work, and it's there. Feel free to check it out, use any of it, some of it, all of it, none of it, whatever you would like, but it's there and it has all the walkthrough of, what we've talked about. Next Church that you may have heard is an organization in our denomination working to further churches into their future, and is also dealing specifically with being an anti-racist organization. They have some amazing resources that you can check out at that link. And then also part of the Next Church, a couple of years ago, some folks got together and wrote the Sarasota Statement, which essentially functions like a confession does in our Book of Confessions. And you can find that on the website. I've used it a few times in worship as the affirmation of faith or statement of faith, and feel free to utilize that resource as well. And the last thing I'll say is to share a quote from a friend of mine, Bruce Reyes Chow, who is a Presbyterian pastor out in on the West Coast, pointing out the divide is not being divisive. And I think a lot of times that is something we need to hear and remind ourselves.
Yeah, and I love that quote, Steve, each time I see it, you know, and you and I have talked. I really think it's important for our church, the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, to really understand that we need to play a very active role in this. It bothers me when I hear people say conservative or the religious right and the perspectives that they have, and they're using code words, which we know are racist words and racist activities, and it's under the umbrella of Christianity. And, you know, I say in circles like, I want to take my cross back, because I really get bothered when people are using religion to advocate for that behavior, which we know are wrong. So it's really important for all of us, and particularly us as Presbyterians, to be in that lead position and then work with our other religious partners to build that coalition to stamp out the aspect that Christians can advocate for racism and inequalities wherever it exists. So it's important that anytime Steve and I get the opportunity to present this material, I feel like I'm doing my small part to just really ask that we play an active role in doing that as religious leaders. And that's important to me. I know it's important to you. And I personally appreciate the opportunity you give us, Steve and I, to really come before you and talk about it. So I think we're good on time. So thank you.
That's our presentation. That is our story. And we're really grateful that you allowed us to come share it. I'll turn the floor back over to whoever we're happy to answer some questions if you have them, but whatever time is available or not available, that's fine too. But again, we just are grateful for y'all letting us come and be with you this morning.
Yes, yes. And what a great story it was. I want to thank you both, Steve Lindsley and the ruling elder, Kevin Hendrick, for that faith-filled, informative presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.